Meanwhile, the national debates over immigration have increasingly centered on questions about American values, about our morals, about what kind of country America would prove itself to be. Are we a melting pot, a welcoming society that champions the family values, work ethic, and entrepreneurial spirit of immigrants? Or are we a nation that believes in law and order, in which undocumented immigrants are lawbreakers who trample upon our sovereignty when they cross our border without papers? In reality, we as a society are both of these nations. And the real question facing us now is whether or not these two visions of America can be woven together in a sensible, law-abiding, and humane manner. After an immigration reform bill failed to pass the Senate in 2007, the second defeat of major legislation in 1 year's time, the debate sputtered for several years. During that time, however, something interesting began to occur. The houses of faith that had largely sat on the sidelines of prior immigration debates began to see the issue in a new light. A fine example is the Willow Creek Community Church in Illinois, which is what is referred to colloquially as a megachurch. It ministers to 17,000 faithful every Sunday. Lynn Hybels, the co-founder of Willow Creek Community Church, describes the demographic changes to her community in the western suburbs of Chicago as an awakening. Her pastoral community reacted to the growing Latino population not with fear or bigotry, but with a welcoming embrace, adding sermons and Bible study in Spanish language. As the communities came to know one another and to build trust through their faith, the pastoral leadership came to learn that many of their parishioners were undocumented or had family members who were out of immigration status and who lived in fear of deportation. Willow Creek is only one example. There are many, many others. Among them is a well-told story in evangelical circles about a Korean gentleman who entered the United States lawfully on a work visa. A deeply religious man, he was called to the ministry. As he studied to become a pastor, his work visa expired, and he slipped into undocumented status. And so as evangelical and other Christian churches began to gain an appreciation of why their congregants and a sizable number of their pastors were residing in unlawful immigration status, they prayed and studied and looked to Scripture. And it is in Scripture that we find the guiding message for these new leaders in the immigration reform movement. Matthew 25 tells us that Jesus will come in his glory and say, "I was a stranger, and you welcomed me." The righteous will respond to him in confusion, asking, "When is it that we saw you as a stranger and welcomed you?" And Jesus will answer the righteous, "Truly I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of me, one of the least of these that are members of my family, you did it to me." And so in welcoming the stranger, feeding his hunger, slaking her thirst, and clothing their children, believers will extend God's love to all. In a striking moment in June 2012, prominent Christian leaders from evangelical churches, the Southern Baptist Convention, Focus on the Family, and other traditionally politically conservative religious organizations issued a shared statement of principles supporting reform of our immigration laws and offering a scriptural foundation for each needed change. Their movement is called the Evangelical Immigration Table, and they describe it as an undeniable biblical responsibility to love and show compassion for the stranger among us. Their statement referenced scripture from Deuteronomy, Leviticus, and Matthew. The religious leaders expressed their belief in the rule of law and their dismay that unjust laws can harm people made in God's image. In doing so, they referred to passages from Isaiah, Jeremiah, Acts, and Romans. They called on the government to enact a new immigration law that enables the undocumented immigrants to come forward and begin to walk down a path that will eventually lead them to lawful status and U.S. citizenship. The evangelical leaders support reforms in the family-based immigration system so that America reunites families instead of separating them for years or even decades, waiting for a visa. And they favor a law that protects our borders and the safety of our communities in a humane and rational manner. This June 2012 announcement was not accidental. It came after months and years of advocates of all stripes, from all political parties, engaging in carefully plotted efforts to educate national Christian leaders and convinced them to join a broad movement with raised voices and a call to action. The timing was choreographed to make a splash after the presidential primaries and before the nominating conventions in 2012. After all, if Richard Land, head of the Southern Baptist Convention, is willing to publicly announce his firm and committed support for humane and sensible immigration reform, well, that is not a moment to waste. The results are yet to be fully realized. The 2012 election resulted in more than 70% of Latino voters and strong majorities of Asian American voters supporting the re-election of President Obama and rejecting the anti-immigrant rhetoric of Mitt Romney, who suggested that undocumented immigrants self-deport. Within days of the election, immigration reform was back on the national agenda. In the months since then, a bipartisan comprehensive reform bill reflecting the components called for by the evangelical and Christian movement and the work of many others passed in the United States Senate. Progress in the House of Representatives will be more difficult, but these newly engaged religious leaders are working hand in hand with the business community, traditional immigrant advocates, and other religious movements to usher in a new system rooted in the message of Matthew 25, of welcoming the stranger. Dr. Martin Luther King spoke of creating a beloved community, which is simply another manner of evoking God's love, as called for in Matthew 25, caring for the least of us. Representative John Lewis, a civil rights leader who marched at Selma and has never stopped fighting for the least of us, assessed our progress a few years ago. He said, "We have not yet created the beloved community." Then, echoing the invocation of Duncan Littlefair, perhaps without knowing it, Representative Lewis continued, "We have not come to that point where we recognize the dignity and worth of every human being. We still have a distance to go before we create one family, one house, the American house." Guided by Scripture and with the partnership of religious leaders who open new hearts and new minds to welcoming the stranger, we may see our nation begin to fulfill the finer elements of our national myths and build the American house. I, for one, am glad to have new friends of faith to walk with us on this journey. Thank you.